Bom, boa noite a todas e todos. Sem mais demora, vamos iniciar nosso seminário de teoria crítica, teorias da justiça, e temos a satisfação de contarmos com o professor doutor Christoph Horn, da Universidade de Bonn. Professor Christoph Horn is an old friend of Drayton and myself. We are very honored to have you here again, Professor Horn, and honoring our critical theory seminar group with your presentation on Michel Foucault and the ancient Greeks. Thank you very much for your availability. I'm just going to be projecting. Let me see here. First of all, if your text is already open. All right. Yeah, it's over here. So Professor Horn was very generous to make available this course, this paper to be projected, so you guys can follow his lecture as he's going to start this presentation. So Professor Horn, the floor is yours.
First of all, let me express my gratitude, dear Nitama, for this kind invitation. Muito obrigado. Let me get started.
So I'm sure that it's going to be, yeah, okay. Yeah, we use the arrows, please.
Okay. One of the most surprising twists in Michel Foucault's already dazzling philosophical biography is his late attempt to arrive at a form of cultivated self-design and aesthetics of existence, l'esthétique de l'existence. What is surprising about this is not so much the recourse to the pre-Christian tradition of ancient philosophy, namely that of self-care, although it is of course astonishing why such a consciously postmodern thinker chooses such an apparently distant historical model. Rather, it is irritating that Foucault seems to be calling for a restitution of the reflected kind of subjectivity whose rejection is firmly associated with his name. According to Foucault's generally received and influential conviction, the modern subject in its social position and its self-reference is to be seen as a product of power processes which make it a subject. With this analysis, Foucault famously turned against traditional philosophical anthropology, according to which man was regarded as a creature of God, as an animal rationale, and as an autonomous, partially non-natural being. In his latest work, i.e. the two volumes 2 and 3 of the History of Sexuality from 1984, Foucault ties in with the classical Hellenistic and imperial eras of antiquity in a way that, in view of his earlier work, seems to require a great deal of explanation. Posthumously, in 2018, the final volume, Les Aveux de la Chair, History de la Sexualité 4, was published from Foucault's manuscripts. It seems difficult to understand how a technique of self-cultivation based on the ancient model could be compatible with the well-known catchphrases of the death of the subject, the disappearance of the subject, or the emptiness of the vanished human being. Is Foucault here abandoning his own critique of the metaphysics of reason, his rejection of the thesis that the human being has a core of identity which is immune to historical or social factors of influence? Is he now distancing himself from his view that man is to be understood as a product of the processes of knowledge and power which constitute him an anonymous subjectless event? My first paragraph is entitled "The Innovative Perspective Adopted in L'Usage des Plaisirs." In the extensive literature on late Foucault, quite controversial assessments can be found regarding the question of whether the two volumes, The Uses of Pleasure, L'Usage des Plaisirs, and Care of the Self, Le Souci de Soi, represent a fundamental revision of Foucault's critique of the subject, or whether they are compatible with it, or perhaps even represent its logical results. The spectrum ranges from the assessment that Foucault ultimately represented the exact opposite of his earlier view, as was claimed by Wetz, to subtle classifications of biographical phases with the aim of proving the consistency of his intellectual development. This was defended by Fink Eitel, to the unifying thesis that Foucault's older analysis of power and his archaeology prepared the ground for the new foundations of ethics. That's according to Schmid. That the late work thus represents the continuation and redemption of the earlier writings. Yet other authors deny the reinstallation of a sovereign subject by the late Foucault. For instance, Hebel, and finally, Wolfgang Dettel attempts to prove that the shift in interests of which Foucault himself expressly speaks can be traced back to a misunderstanding of classical antiquity, its concept of love, and its model of self-aestheticization. However, at least prima facie, the impression cannot easily be denied that the two books which Foucault wrote essentially during the last 8 months of his life represent a marked change in his views. Let us first look at the beginning of The Use of Pleasure. In the introduction under the title Modifications, Foucault states that in order to prove the historical specificity of our modern Western concept of sexuality, he initially focused solely on 3 axes that are central to the experience of the subject. And I quote now from the English translation: "The formation of the knowledge that relates to it, which means to sexuality, the systems of power that regulate its exercise, and the forms in which individuals can and must recognize themselves as subjects of this sexuality." End of quotation. However, in order to understand the modern subject who has a certain experience of sexuality, it is also necessary to, I quote, "identify the way in which Western man has had to recognize himself as a subject of desire for centuries," end of quotation. What has been missing so far is the level of an individual's attitude towards his or her sexual impulses. A little later, Foucault speaks unmistakably of a programmatic reorientation. I quote, "I had to choose either maintain the preconceived plan and add a rapid historical examination of this theme of desire, or to restart the whole investigation around the slow formation of a self-hermeneutic in antiquity." End of quotation. Foucault opted for the second wing of this alternative, which supports the reading that sees a fundamental reorientation of late Foucault. It is also a fact that, according to the original plan, Volume 1 of the History of Sexuality was to be followed by a Volume 2 entitled The Confessions of the Flesh, which dealt with the role of Christianity in the formation of modern attitudes to sexuality, then a Volume 3, The Children's Crusade, on the subject of sex education, then a Volume 4, Population and Races, a Volume 5, The Woman, the Mother, and the Hysteric, and finally a volume 6 entitled The Perverts. However, these works have never been completed. Only the present volume 2, which was, as I mentioned, edited in 2018, it's now volume 4, still pursues the older program of exploring the effects of the repressive power complex on the area of individual sexual life. In the course of historical studies on antiquity, there was instead a clear shift of interest towards ancient self-techniques. Foucault gives a pointed account of this in an interview from April 1983, where he says, I quote, "I must confess that I'm much more interested in problems of self-techniques and the like than in sex. Sex is boring." End of quotation. This is, of course, an exaggeration, since the central question of the subject of sexuality remains in the two volumes at hand. However, it is true that self-techniques now form the hidden main topic. Foucault differentiates between three epochs of the ancient concept of self-design, to which he devotes three separate studies. Firstly, classical Greek antiquity, especially the 4th century BC, whereby he mainly draws on texts by Xenophon, Plato, and Aristotle. This is the subject of the uses of pleasure. Secondly, he distinguishes late Roman antiquity, primarily the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD, for which he refers to authors such as Artemidorus, Plutarch, Seneca, and Galen. This period is the subject of the care of the self. Thirdly and finally, he deals with the era of early Christianity, which has both continuous and discontinuous elements to the self-care of pagan antiquity. This last era is presented in the completed but later published volume Les Aveux de la Chair, The Confessions of the Flesh. Sexuality in classical antiquity. In the uses of pleasure, the basic thesis is that sexuality in classical antiquity was problematized from a fundamentally different perspective than in the later Christian culture. For the classical authors, the threat of sexuality lies in the endangerment of personal autonomy, but nowhere is that interpreted as intrinsically bad or even as an expression of malice, decay, and of sin. In other words, the subject of sexual desire is treated from the point of view of a subject who fears being overwhelmed by the violence of erotic impulses. Foucault writes, I quote, "In order to constitute itself as a virtuous and moderating subject, in the use it makes of its lusts, its pleasures, the individual must therefore establish a relationship to itself that belongs to the type domination, obedience, command, submission, mastery, docility, and not, later in Christian spirituality, to the type sifting, denial, deciphering, purification. This is what one could call the heautocratic structure of the subject in the moral practice of lusts of pleasures." End of quotation. Strikingly, there is no term in the ancient languages that could be used as a conceptual equivalent to our modern word sexuality, i.e., no concept that would summarize behaviors but also sensations, images, desires, instincts, passions of the sexual type. Foucault therefore relies on the term chresis ton aphrodison, which is commonly used in medical and philosophical literature. His object of investigation is therefore the principles behind the various forms of regulation of sexual behavior. The further course of argumentation in the use of pleasure is determined by a thematic quadrangle of sexual rigor, as he says, namely first, behavior towards one's own body, second, behavior of man and woman in marriage, third, behavior towards boys, and fourth, behavior towards truth. According to Foucault, each of these four topics corresponds to a subdiscipline of the ancient self-techniques: dietetics to the bodily self-reference, economics to married life, eroticism to the behavior towards boys, and philosophy to the attitude towards truth. First point. In the medical and philosophical literature of classical antiquity, it is striking how much attention was paid to the phenomenon of a healthy, appropriate, or correct lifestyle. This includes countless prescriptions, advice, or recommendations on personal hygiene, on health prophylaxis, or the cure of ailments, on physical training, on questions of diet and sleep, and on the regulation of sexual life. The Greek term diaetia, which means verbally way of life, can be rendered as dietetics. The rules of ancient dietetics are a phenomenon in need of explanation, not only because of their enormous number and distribution, but also because of their level of detail. Despite the appearance of a hyperregulation, Foucault rejects the assumption that this is a model of moral codification. According to Foucault's conviction, the complex ancient dietetics has a consultative task. The aim is to advise the individual in order to increase their self-determination. Foucault's assessment becomes clearest in the following passage, I quote, "It is clear that the diet as a rule of life, as a way of life, is a fundamental category in which the human conduct of life can be conceived. It characterizes the way in which one leads one's existence and makes it possible to endow the conduct of life with rules, a problematization of behavior with regard to a nature that one has to preserve and to which one has to adapt. Diet is a whole art of living." End of quotation. With regard to the sexual act, Foucault aptly elaborates on the ancient view that there was a risk of self-harm through excessively practiced sexual intercourse. Sexual desire, as a particularly violent drive, is dangerous in that every sexual act drains valuable vital energy from the male body, namely the substance that enable men to transmit life. Excessive sexual practice would therefore lead to a depotency or exhaustion, which could even be life-threatening. Dietetics is clearly understood here as a part of properly allocating one's limited powers and achieving the most favorable balance of pleasures through refined forms of limitation, and not as the regulation of the individual's natural drives. Second point, in the case of the relationship between spouses or the marriage, Foucault again develops the view that male self-control was at the center of ancient life techniques. In classical antiquity, marriage was viewed mainly from the perspective of the distribution of tasks in good household management, which is why the central discipline for a successful partnership was that of economics. Foucault examines the traditional treatises on economics with the result that they ascribed a leadership responsibility to the man in marriage and in household planning, which led secondarily to the demand for self-control. In Foucault's words, I quote, "One must understand that marriage, the functions of the head of the family, the government of the oikos, presuppose that one has become capable of governing oneself." End of quotation. Foucault thus characterizes the ideal of marriage in classical Greece as one that is simultaneously determined by reciprocity and asymmetry. What is meant is that man and woman enter into a regulated relationship of rights and duties, which only includes the principle of strict monogamy for the woman, while the man is basically free to maintain further sexual relationships. Again, a limitation of this exemption of the man arises solely in the sense of prudential advice, for only he who has learned to moderate and to control himself is a personality capable of appropriate household management. Foucault characterizes this advice on prudence as follows, I quote, "The husband owes it, prudence, to himself insofar as being married leads him into a special game of duties and demands in which his reputation, his happiness, his relationship to others, his prestige in the polis, in the city, and his will to lead a beautiful and good existence are at stake." End of quotation. Thirdly, as far as the relationship between men is concerned, Foucault rightly emphasizes the fundamental difference that exists between classical Greek understanding of pederasty, of the boys' loves, and the modern concept of homosexuality. The high esteem in which same-sex partnership was held in classical times is therefore a phenomenon of strictly limited scope. Greek pederasty was limited to relationships between mature, educated, and socially privileged men and boys who had no beard growth. These are therefore not life partnerships, but temporary relationships. The relationships were purely voluntary and brought the boys the benefits of help, education, friendship, and encouragement from their lovers. The voluntary nature of pederasty is already expressed in the fact that it takes place in open public places, such as the gymnasium. When it comes to boys' love, however, Foucault resorts to a pointed and quite daring interpretation. He sees it as an expression of the idea that an adult man only has an adequate object of his erotic inclination if he does not limit himself to the so-called inferior female sexual partners. The female sex being inferior. On the one hand, therefore, only a man seems to be an adequate object of male desire. On the other hand, it would be unworthy of a free adult man to be to be the desired object, and consequently to play the passive role in the sexual act. The solution to this problem lies in boys' love, in pederasty, as the adolescent, as a man, is an appropriate sexual object, and as a young man can easily play the subordinate and passive role at the same time. Whether this reconstruction is correct remains to be seen. Normally it's rejected by scholars. However, Foucault rightly refers to the special esteem in which pederasty is held by Plato, for example, as you know, from the Symposium, for instance. And as we know, it is Plato who develops a concept of philosophical eros based on this pederastic love, this boyish love. Fourth point, it seems strange at first that Foucault also treats philosophy, i.e., the relationship of the individual to the reflected search for truth, in the context of the ancient understanding of sexuality. However, as just explained, in his view, it is precisely the self-stilization in the case of boyish love that leads to the problem of an appropriate approach to truth. While in Christian and modern culture, the connection between lust and truth is always linked, as in Faust, for instance, with the motive of love for women, their virginity, their purity, their fall, and their redeeming power. In Plato, there is a direct connection between pederasty and philosophy. Foucault describes this link on the basis of four transitions. First, for reasons of overcoming asymmetry, there is a transition in Plato from the question of individual and context-related love behavior to the question of the essence, the invariant constitutive characteristics of love. Secondly, there is a transition from the question of the boy's honor to the question of the love of truth. Thirdly, Plato moves from the question of the asymmetry of the partners to the question of the convergence of the partners. And fourthly, there is a transition from the virtue of the beloved boy to the love of the master, in this case Socrates and his wisdom. Foucault attaches great importance to emphasizing that this transformation of pederasty into philosophy does not imply any disdain for the former. The asceticism or renunciation recommended here does not imply any rejection of sexual practices. I quote Foucault, "One would miss the point if one thought that love for boys has brought about its own prohibition, or that an ambiguity inherent in philosophy had only accepted its reality in order to demand that it be overcome. One must bear in mind that this asceticism is not intended to disqualify love for boys. On the contrary, it was a matter of stylizing it, and thus, by giving it form and shape, enhancing it." End of quotation. Re-evaluations in Roman antiquity. In the volume The Care of the Self, Foucault first analyzes the dream book of Artemidorus. He works out the astonishing fact that sexuality is not an independent topic of this book, the dream book, although it contains numerous descriptions of sexual dream content. Instead, Artemidorus understands sexually colored dreams mainly as an expression of an individual's social status or moral condition. For example, in the question of whether someone has to play the active and dominant or the inferior, the passive part within the sexual act. In Foucault's view, his dream book thus testifies to the persistence of a conception of the use of desire that has to do with self-aestheticization and with rejection or suspicion in principle. Subsequently, however, Foucault is concerned with historical differentiation. He attempts to show, by means of examples, that there are clear shifts in the conception of sexuality and self-techniques in late antiquity without it being possible to speak of a radical re-evaluation. The attitude towards sexual practice in the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD tends to become more critical, distant, insecure, and disdainful. According to Foucault, the appreciation of pederasty in particular was on the wane. I quote, mistrust of lust, insistence on the effects of its abuse on the body and soul, re-evaluation of marriage and conjugal duties, twinkling interests in the spiritual meanings attached to boyish love. There is a rigor in the thinking of the philosophers and doctors of the first 2 centuries to which the texts of Soranus and of Rufus of Ephesus, of Musonius or Seneca, of Plutarch, as well as of Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius bear witness. End of quotation. In this context, Foucault speaks of a culture of the self, no longer of an aesthetics of existence. He emphasizes the special position that exercise practices, ascetic techniques and methods of soul guidance now play. According to Foucault, the importance of individual solitary forms of self-stylization declined significantly in late antiquity, i.e. in the Roman imperial period. The weight of institutional connections and professional forms of health and existential counseling became much stronger than in classical antiquity. Foucault then takes up the pattern of behavior towards one's own body, the spouse and the boy from the uses of pleasure. It is true of dietetics that it has essentially remained constant since classical times. Attention to one's own body even seems to have increased noticeably. Foucault notes of a growing concern about sexual phenomena and a growing attention to their pathological forms. As far as attitudes towards marriage are concerned, Foucault believes he can register 2 important changes: a turn towards an aestheticization of the individual relationship, thank you so much, on the one hand, and a greater emphasis on mutual fidelity on the other. Therein, a Stoic ethics of mutual self-realization comes into play. And finally, Foucault argues that although the practice of pederasty was accepted and practiced unchanged in late antiquity, theoretical interest in it had waned considerably as social conditions had changed significantly. Pagan and Christian sexual ethics. What is the difference between the sexual ethics of pagan antiquity and those of Christianity? Foucault clearly rejects the usual assessment that this difference consists in the following 4 aspects. Firstly, in the evaluation of the nature of the sexual act, only Christianity had linked it to the fall, to original sin, and to death. Then, in the relationship to monogamous fidelity, only Christianity had demanded a strict limitation of sexuality to monogamous marriage. Furthermore, in the evaluation of homosexuality, which in turn had only been strictly evaluated as unnatural in Christianity, and finally, in the typically Christian appreciation of chastity, abstinence, and virginity. In all 4 respects, contrary to a widespread opinion, there is a considerable continuity, or at least no sharp contrast, between pagan and Christian views. Instead, the point of difference that matters to Foucault is based on the distinction between codes of behavior and forms of subjectivation from which morality is constituted. According to Foucault, Christian sexual morality is strongly oriented towards codes and rules of behavior, while the pagan antique attitude towards sexuality is determined by self-practices and ascetic techniques. Pagan antiquity is interested in aspects of moderation, self-control, and self-stylization from an individual perspective, while Christian reflection is oriented towards aspects of the fallen nature and universally valid laws. In principle, this assessment seems to me correct, which is reflected, for example, in the recognition of Foucault's work by Pierre Hadot. Hadot and Foucault met at the Collège de France and had a brief but fruitful exchange on the questions of the ancient concept of self-care. Hadot was at that time one of the leading French historians of philosophy. He has become known to a wider public through his thesis that is remarkably close to Foucault's project. According to this, ancient philosophy as a whole can be described as the art of living, in Greek techne to biou, in Latin ars vitae, i.e. not only ethics, but also the theoretical disciplines of logic or dialectics and physics, which means natural philosophy. According to Hadot, philosophical knowledge in antiquity is always oriented towards the person seeking knowledge or orientation. The aim of this orientation towards the addressee lies in the rational cultivation of the person, their self-design through a fundamental change of attitude, and in the correction and of misguided attitudes to life, usually through affect therapy. There is a little reduplication here, and I skip the next paragraph and continue here. This, at least, is the famous claim defended by Pierre Hadot in his two books, Exercices spirituels et philosophie antique from 1981 and Qu'est-ce que la philosophie antique from 1995. Now, more precisely, I continue here. Hadot interprets the ancient idea of self-management and self-transformation as based on arguments as well as on training. The arguments concern our attitudes for life, its brevity, contingency, and vulnerability, the goods we should follow, and the evils we should avoid. The training practiced in this tradition is philosophical thought experiments, imaginings, and literary routines designed to lead a change of one's inner attitudes. Hadot distinguishes between four basic strategies of the philosophical art of living, which he locates in the various ancient schools and summarizes under the following headings: A, learning to live; B, learning to dialogue; C, learning to die; and finally D, learning to read. He assigns to these four areas specific exercises which are intended to bring about a personal transformation and which, if successful, should ensure a good life. The concrete content of these exercises, however, differ, as Hadot shows, from school to school. They depend on the respective understanding of a good life. By the way, I myself, in my book from 1998 and in my articles on the topic, I differentiate the ancient exercises as follows. There are, on the one hand, differences according to the methods, and on the other hand, according to pedagogical intentions. According to the first classification, we should distinguish between A, literary; B, dialogical; C, monological; and D, imaginative practices. And with regard to the second classification, namely the pedagogical aims, we have to deal with, in my opinion, first therapeutic, second sensitizing, thirdly moral, fourth intellectual, and five spiritual practices. So I'm roughly following Addo, but I'm going more into details. Now, it is certainly true that we find in ancient philosophy some subtle theories of self-transformation based on reflection and exercise. The Greek expression for exercise, i.e. ascesis, melete, and gymnasia, and their Latin equivalents, meditatio and exercitatio, are highly relevant for philosophy in classical and post-classical philosophy. On this point, Addo's writings are of outstanding importance. The Socratic and Platonic formula of the care of the soul, epimeliates psyches, or the description of Hellenistic philosophy as a therapy of the affects, only gets its full meaning when seen from this perspective. As these formulas indicate, practical concerns form the backbone of philosophical activities. They rest upon the shared observation that passions such as dissolute desires or exaggerated fears are for men the main cause of suffering, debauchery, and unconsciousness. The therapies, however, differ widely from one another. To give an example, the Stoics aspired to tension, tonos, characterized by constant vigilance, attention, prosoche, while the Epicureans prefer relaxation, anesis. In both exemplary cases, these ideals of lifestyle can be achieved through proper exercises, thus producing an attitude that would ultimately lead towards a good life. Consequently, the relation between a teacher and a student was organized as a personal relationship of guidance. According to Addo, whom I present here as the better Foucault, you see that, philosophical knowledge in antiquity, unlike in modern times, is always oriented to the person who seeks knowledge or orientation. It is, as one says, agent-centered. Philosophy as a discipline and as professionally imparted knowledge is related to the intellectual capacity, the character disposition, the level of knowledge, and the need for knowledge of the respective student. The intended result of this process lies in the rational cultivation of a person, her self-shaping, the correction of misguided attitudes in life, or in a fundamental revision of her goals in life. Therefore, we find in ancient philosophy the ideal of the perfectly developed, virtuous individual, the philosophos, the Stoic sage, Sophos, the Aristotelian Spudaios, Phronimus, or the Epiaikes, and the like. So you see that I presented here Pierre Addo as the guy who corrected, the scholar who corrected Foucault. Ancient ethics and postmodern ethics of aesthetics of existence. Let us now return to Foucault and his impact on our contemporary situation. It would certainly be a misunderstanding to raise the suspicion of a pure aestheticism or egocentrism against ancient ethics, but especially against Foucault's turn towards an aesthetics of existence or against the concept of self-stylization. This has been done by several authors. The concept of subjecting one's life to a reflective personal shaping has less the character of intellectual snobbery than that of increasing the quality of life and of autonomy. Foucault also emphasizes the high value of communal life, of friendship, and of solidarity. justified critical remarks on Foucault's historical thesis, on the one hand, come especially from Wolfgang Dethl in his monograph from 1998. Dethl first raises concerns about the isolation of sexuality within the overall phenomenon of pleasure. In this context, he rightly points out to my mind that the eudaimonistic theoretical framework, which is just as decisive for the evaluation of pleasure as it is, for example, for the evaluation of affects, desires, or virtues. Dethl certainly agrees with Foucault when he emphasizes that the ancient authors pursued a model of harmony or embedding rather than a concept based on a metaphor of struggle. Nevertheless, it can be pointed out that Foucault registered Aristotle's conceptual distinction between enkrateia, which means the fighting self-control, and sophrosyne, which means the harmonious self-relation of the virtuous person, quite accurately and judged it aptly, although he admittedly ignores Plato's harmony model of the soul. Dethl also makes necessary corrections to the phenomenon of pederasty, which in antiquity did not have the significance assumed by Foucault. Finally, he particularly emphasizes his opposition to Foucault's analysis of the Platonic concept of eros. He does so in his book from 1998, chapter 5. Dethl makes it plausible that Plato and his concept of eros is connected to epistemology and political philosophy in a much more complex way than Foucault saw that. But as attractive as the ancient model of self-cultivation may be, is it really transferable to our present days? Does Foucault really recommend recourse to a historical solution? In the interview from April 1983, which I already quoted above, he states succinctly, I quote, "One does not find the solution to a problem in the solution to another problem that was raised by other people at another time." End of quotation. Foucault is by no means attempting to transplant foreign historical tissue into the organism of the present, especially since there was hardly any problematization of the underprivileged position of slaves, of women, and of foreigners in antiquity. What is more, if Foucault were to simply revert to the past, he would presuppose a central point of his own fundamental convictions, namely the thesis of the historicity and contingency of all human culture. As Paul Bain has rightly pointed out, I quote, he never thought of seeing in the sexual ethics of the Greeks an alternative to Christian ethics. Quite the contrary, there are no problems that are analogous across the centuries, just as little as nature or reason. End of quotation. However, Bain also rightly emphasizes that Foucault was thinking of extracting the idea of work on oneself from ancient ethics as an element and transferring it to the present, in the manner of those pillars of pagan temples, as someone sometimes sees them reused in more recent buildings. The precise sense in which this concept could be revived today is not an easy question to answer, given the diversity of its forms in antiquity and the greatly changed modern conditions. Foucault was at best able to tackle this problem in the short time he had left in his life, especially in conversations with friends and in his interviews. Final remark. Let us return to the question of the extent to which we can speak of a change in Foucault's position with regard to the uses of pleasure and the care of the self. On the one hand, there's certainly continuity insofar as Foucault continues to recommend the recovery of an ethics of self-design against the background of his assessment of modernity as an age of overpowering authoritarianism and rule-oriented systems of repression. There is no doubt that recourse to the ancient techniques of life in this respect presupposes an unchanged diagnosis of the present. On the other hand, the justification of a judgment such as the following seems irrefutable. I quote, Foucault has obviously abandoned his post-structuralist attempt to think of power monistically as an all-encompassing network of a subjectless, anonymous multiplicity of forces. End of quotation. This was said by Fink Eitel in 1997. And there are similar claims by other authors. If the quoted assessment is correct, Foucault would incidentally be an important witness to a general theoretical development that can be observed in both continental and in Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy. There is a recognizable tendency to challenge or even replace the older anti-Cartesianism with newer approaches in the philosophy of subjectivity. The parallel with Richard Rorty is therefore particularly interesting in Rorty's work too, an early phase critical of subjectivity, which, unlike Foucault's, is based on an eliminative materialism, is followed by a recovery of individuality under the keywords of self-creation and self-invention. Incidentally, this seems to be precisely the point at which the clearest difference between Foucault and Rorty on the one hand and the ancient practice of the art of living and self-care can be identified. Ancient models consistently follow the principle become who you are. That is, they conceive of the identity to be established through self-practices as the perfectionist fulfillment or completion of essential dispositions of the individual. Foucault and Rorty contrast this perfectionist conception of self-design, self-fashioning, as a realization of being with the concept of radical self-creation. The become who you are model is replaced by them by an invent yourself model. According to the second view, one's own identity is subject to the individual's autonomy of preference in a fundamental sense. However, it is doubtful whether contemporary authors really have an advantage over antiquity in this respect, whether the question of the good or successful life can be satisfactorily resolved by radically subjectivist approaches, or whether objectivist models are preferable, is a highly controversial issue in the current debate after Rorty, Foucault, and these models of self-invention. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Horn, for this beautiful and thought-provoking lecture. We're going to open the floor for discussions, for questions, comments. So anyone who would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand if you are online, or if you are here in the room, please let me know that you have a question. I'm just checking the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to myself ask a couple of questions to Professor Horn. Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation of Foucault's philosophy of sexuality. it's indeed, well, let's see if we can fit the two of us in the same image. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I really appreciated the way not only you reconstituted most of the arguments and problems at work at stake in these very interesting and controversial analysis of sexuality. I thought that I could ask you two general questions. One relating more to philological and things relating to Greek translations or translations of the Greek text, since you pointed to several passages, including the whole thing of sexuality itself, and but also relating to the way Foucault thought about dietetics, etc., and even his approach to techne to view ars vitae or art of living. These all, of course, entail a certain interpretation of a Greek text. And I understood that you, as a Greek scholar and as an Aristotle scholar, ancient philosophy scholar, have your own takes about this, and I found your reading rather generous regarding Foucault. And I will have then one question relating to these problems of a translation, relating to the term ascesis, right, or exercise, gymnasium, and you mentioned several examples. We think of Nietzsche's usage of the term in his genealogy of morals when he's talking about asceticism. And of course, Foucault is very fond of Nietzsche's reading of ascesis. So my first question would be precisely, how do you see the way some people think of asceticism in a rather critical way? If we think of both the young Nietzsche and the young Marx reading, for instance, of religion, they were very critical, of course, of religion, and therefore it would be very easy to make this kind of a criticism of religious asceticism. And of course, Nietzsche extends this to a moral asceticism. But now it seems that Foucault helped us rehabilitate the sense of ascesis as not being necessarily something pejorative, right? Of course, this was already Nietzsche's intention when he was perhaps making a criticism of this tradition of philosophy that starts with this metaphysical emphasis on the intelligible vis-a-vis the sensible, in a way that it seems that the body and health itself, this is the way Nietzsche thought about medicine and diseases and pathologies, would be all as part of this intellectualist approach to philosophy that tends to downplay the body and sexuality and everything relating to the flesh, precisely by following some kind of a Christian refusal of the flesh and of anything that's bodily. And therefore, Foucault is somehow rehabilitating ascesis to see that we can even, in our own understanding of self-government or self-techniques, or self-care, as you mentioned, to rehabilitate the sense of ascesis as applied to our own subjectivation. This would be one question. Another question would be very much more in terms of your own philosophical interpretation of this problem of the ancients, as you, in your concluding remarks, made very clear that, of course, it's not necessarily the case that we should follow Foucault's conclusion that one is going to lead the pathway of self-care or self-invention, as you put it, as opposed to, or self-creation, as opposed to becoming what one is, right? can think of the idea of a conatus, but as you put it in Phronesis and in ancient philosophy, we have more this idea of becoming what one is in terms of essence. Even in Spinoza, we can find this. So I'd like to see how would you relate this second problem to the fact that Foucault recognized that, of course, the problematization of certain terms, even the way relating to the first question, he saw the problem of not having an object for philosophy in sexuality among the ancients. We had other ways of approaching this problem. So my question is precisely, as you put it so well, and you even quoted from Paul Vane, in the sense that Foucault is not trying to say that we're just going to be adapting the same model from one ancient period to another in modernity. This doesn't make sense, and it wasn't Foucault's intention, of course. But then, how do you see the idea of this care of oneself in terms of a technique of the self or technologies of the self? This was another possible translation that Foucault himself used in English in his Dartmouth lectures. But this idea that techne could be translated both episteme, as we think in the Heideggerian sense of a technology or technoscience, but also in the case of Foucault, he's using techne to translate art, right? As you put it so well in terms of a techne tubiu as ars vitae, and therefore we can think of a techne as some kind of a poiesis. So I'd like to see how yourself would respond to this problem, because we saw from your other lectures here your criticism of Heidegger's reading of the problem of technology, as you put it so well, in being faithful to Heidegger's own intent, which was to distance himself. He didn't like the way technological society was going in this direction. And I think very much in the sense that also Husserl was anticipating with the mathematization of nature, all this whole thing of technoscience. But it seems that in Foucault, he's also trying to rehabilitate a sense of techne that allows for a not necessarily, let's say, demonizing attitude vis-a-vis technology. So if you keep technology only at an instrumental level, that's one thing. But when we use techne in the sense of an art of a becoming, and not necessarily self-invention or self-creation, but even in terms of a self-becoming, don't you think it's possible to recast this conception of techne also in some contemporary sense without necessarily falling into aestheticism? Because I agree with, it was at the very beginning you mentioned this term. I myself, I thought that postmodernist and post-structuralist readings of Foucault and Heidegger, they tend to go in this aestheticist direction, like Adorno and others in the so-called Frankfurt School. In my opinion, rightly perceived, it was a problem, even in Heidegger's reading, that could be aestheticist in this sense. But I would like to see from your own conception of a technique as poiesis, whether you think it's possible to have this conception and to make it compatible with the idea of a technique also as science. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your important and even brilliant questions. The first question was about exercises and ascesis. Look, what Foucault is emphasizing, and Pierre Hadot even more carefully elaborates, is that the verbs for doing exercises, askein, askeo, askein, meletan, from which melete as a substantive is noun is derived, and gymnasia, these three terms mean to repeat a practice, as it is, for instance, described in Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, the first chapter. So repeat, repeat, repeat. Playing the guitar is repetition, and this thought of ascesis is different from the Christian notion of asceticism, namely as leaving the world behind. Look, let me introduce here something which goes back to the Protestant theologian Adolf von Harnack in the 20th century. Von Harnack distinguished between, let me say it in German, Verzichtsaskese and Ertüchtigungsaskese. Verzichtsaskese means to get rid of all of these superfluous things, to leave the world behind, to make an ascetic guy out of me, a monk, right? A nun, yeah? So leaving the world behind. Whereas asceticism in the ancient sense, Ertüchtigungsaskese, means to activate oneself, right? Not to leave the world behind, but to activate oneself, to choose oneself, and so on. And this is really a deep difference. So the ascetic practice in pagan antiquity was rather a self-activation, whereas the ascetic practice in Christian, later ancient reality and in the medieval world and the early modern world was rather to leave the world behind as a monk, as a nun, as a priest. This is, I think, crucial. And then still, it is right what Foucault emphasizes, namely that one must be careful not to spend too much force and power onto sexuality or eating or something like that. So it's still a practice of self-limitation, but a self-limitation only for the sake of the best possible outcome of self-mastery, self-mastership. So this is meant. By the way, Nietzsche himself, for instance, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, emphasizes this thing which he calls the great reason of the body, die große Vernunft des Leibes. And he describes there and in the gay science that he practices sports and he walks 2 hours a day in Sils Maria and so on. And what he wants to emphasize by this is that training, exercise, workout is a crucial element of self-constitution. This is what he himself wants to say, but he rejects the mistaken sorts of asceticism as obsolete. But clearly he has himself his own practice of asceticism, and he connects that to the bodily wisdom. So the wisdom which is in the body, a topic of psychoanalysis later, and the more bodily focused types of philosophy. For instance, Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phénoménologie de la perception, so the body-based sorts of philosophy. Now your second point, it is about essentialism, and it was about essentialism.
The technique to view not as a self-invention or self-becoming.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think what is crucial for all these ancient models, and it has been seen by Piaget, but not so much by Foucault, is that they all are presupposing an essence of mankind, of human beings. So we are a species, we are members of a species which is perfectible and must be perfected during the course of one's individual life, right? So babies are born in a very suboptimal state. They can do almost nothing, whereas other species are better off with regard to their original endowment of talents and of capacities, capabilities. We must learn almost everything from the moment of our birth until the early adult period of our life. We must learn almost everything. And then they extrapolate from that, and they are saying, still, as someone who has reached his or her full rational nature. Normally, it's seen as the age of 14, in which one is achieving one's full rational nature, or could achieve. It is still not over, but in each period of your life, you have to realize your rational identity and go further and further. And so eudaimonia, which is happiness, is about the full realization of each period of your life. But you are following then a program. You are following a natural program which is inborn. Yeah. Aristotle even has a concept for that, entelecheia, which means realize an inborn program. Right? So if everything goes well in one's life, then one realizes the inborn program and becomes eudaimon, happy, in the objective sense. Whereas normally historians of thought identify Michel de Montaigne in early modernity as the turning point of this sort of ars vitae techne to be conception. So if you read the essays written by Montaigne, you see that he quotes on every page ancient sources. He quotes Roman authors, many pages in many respects, but he means thereby something different, namely a self-invention, a self-constitution that is not following an inborn program, but some sort of autonomous self-design or something. And I think that Foucault could have had made clearer that he belongs to the modern tradition, which is also the tradition of Nietzsche and Heidegger, namely take from being and time, from Sein und Zeit, take the concept of Eigentlichkeit, of authenticity. Authenticity in Heidegger means that one does what only you and only at that time can be done by the individual agent. It does not mean following a program. Right. It does not mean especially following the categorical imperative or utilitarianism. So it means to do what can be individual, the best what can be individually done. And you are authentic in a sort of self-choice, right? So self-care in Heidegger is self-choice. And already in Nietzsche, you find this idea of an amor fati, which means to have an open horizon and to turn away from your embedding conditions. So you are not restricted. You have an open perspective in your life and need not follow the categorical imperative and so on. This would hinder, this would impede your innermost chances. By the way, in the 20th and early 21st century, it was especially Bernard Williams, the British philosopher who defended that idea of Nietzschean ethics against the Kantian standpoint. So, in this sense, the techne to biou in the ancient world, the ars vitae, was essentialist and perfectionist.
Right.
And each of these authors, starting from Michel de Montaigne, but especially Nietzsche and Heidegger, are anti-essentialists. And they claim, so they take the ancient idea, look, even in the Being and Time, in the book Sein und Zeit, you find this story, this myth, this fable of Pura.
Oh yeah.
Sorge, so care, So
And also in German, hygienus, right? Hygienus.
Exactly. And you find also the idea of anticipating death. Vorlaufen zum Tode. You are taking death seriously. You are aware of your own death, which is, in a sense, a meditatio, meditatio mortis.
Montaigne as well.
It is in Montaigne too,
but
and it is an idea first coined in Stoicism.
Right.
Whereas the Epicureans say, oh no, it would be a self-misunderstanding
Right.
to anticipate death, since we should get rid of the fear of death, and we should not imagine how we are dying, going to the doctor, and the doctor announces we will pass away 3 days later, or whatever, or lying in the grave. We shouldn't imagine that. But that is an element which comes from Stoicism to Christianity and is still present in Heidegger, this anticipation of one's own death. So I think that Heidegger still has this core idea, but you are right, of course, he does not want to adopt the term of techne for that, since it sees in the techne tradition the homo faber like way of subjugating the world and having a wrong sort of attitude towards being in general.
But it was very interesting because, let's, would you guys like to ask some question? Please, feel free. You can ask the question in Portuguese. It's okay. Otherwise, I would carry on this conversation. Let me see if you're... we have plenty of time. If anyone would like to raise a question, please feel free to do so. Please manifest yourself. I have to see your little hand. Você pode colocar sua mão aí, levantar a mãozinha do dashboard, ou colocar no chat seu nome, se você quer se inscrever, ou se manifestar. Pode fazer uma pergunta em português, se alguém quiser fazer, porque o tema é esse dos 3 volumes, na verdade foi mencionado até o 4º, né, da história da sexualidade, do Michel Foucault, e como nós fazemos essa releitura dos gregos antigos, particularmente do estoicismo. So, to continue the conversation, I'd like to see how would you associate the conception of a moral progress, because just to go straight to the point, I see that for lots of readers of Foucault, including an ongoing discussion in critical theory nowadays, especially I'm thinking of Professor Rainer Forst in his interlocution with Professor Amy Allen, and they both have been in our meetings in critical theory in Brazil. But we know that Amy Allen was very critical of both forced and honest conception of progress, because the criticism is basically to say, just like Nietzsche was already saying in his own time, that there was some idea of a progress in the very conception of the Enlightenment, of the Aufklärung, and therefore, Nietzsche says in his very sarcastic way, "I'm not interested in, bettering humankind, or to improve humanity, or to improve humankind. No, this is a meaningless, or a senseless project, because it's not going to lead anywhere, since there is no telos, there is no finality. That's the very leads towards this transvaluation of values, and therefore this is a nihilism. And Foucault took seriously this idea, but I found very interesting that the way you just presented eudaimonia in Aristotle, this idea that eudaimonia has this, if understood as you are proposing, as human flourishing. Therefore, it's an idea that it's holistic, in the sense that it comprises the whole of human becoming, and therefore there is some idea of a moral progress in one's own development, in one's own physis, because the idea of a physis in Greek is the very idea of a growth, of a becoming, very much in the Aristotelian terms you put for entelegia. So my question is this the way you make a case, for instance, for Kant's or the Aufklärung's conception of moral progress? Because, of course, even someone like John Rawls is going to say, of course we have moral progress, because no one is going to be making a case publicly for slavery, racism, and stuff like that. Of course, we change the way we conceive our own conceptions of the good in terms of morality in our own customs, right? Sitten. But of course, some people think that this idea of a moral progress would be compromised by a certain metaphysical teleology. And therefore, Foucault is very known as someone that's becoming somehow cynical about the fate of humanity, and the idea that you don't know where world history is going to. There is no particular telos. But even if we take contingency, and I understand that that's part of your proposal, it's not that we are downplaying contingency in history to say that things are contingent, that you don't have to be a Hegelian. That's Foucault's problem with Hegelian necessitarianism. But then, how can you make a case for a moral progress? And please correct me if this is not a good way of reasoning, and associate it with eudaimonia in the very way that in one's own lifetime one experiences this way of coming to better understand oneself. Is the whole thing of self-knowledge, correlated to the idea that one is always trying also to improve oneself in terms of becoming oneself. So I'd just like to see how eudaimonia could respond, or perfectionism, as you put it, ancient Greek perfectionism, could respond to this criticism of moral progress following Nietzsche and Foucault nowadays, because it's a big issue also in critical theory, and this is a critical theory seminar. Thank you.
Let me start from Kant, who in his little writing Idea of a Universal History with Cosmopolitan Purpose from 1784 developed a theory which is surprisingly close to Aristotelianism and to Stoicism. Namely, he says the life of a man, of human beings, is about talent development. We have an inborn program. It sounds very much like Aristotle and the Stoics. He even says nature does nothing in vain, which is a surprisingly element. So there is no redundancy. We are equipped exactly in the way in which we should develop ourselves. And then he says something interesting, which is not in Aristotle and in Stoicism. Namely, he says mankind, humanity, has the deplorable fate that it is not possible to develop a full set of talents within the lifespan of an individual. Yeah? So you are born, me are born, everybody here is born under conditions in which our short life, if we are lucky, we will be 80 or 90 years of age when we die, is not enough for developing our talents. What's really lacking is the full rational and the full moral identity which we could have. But in order to have that, it takes an intergenerational process of development, and this is his idea of progress. So historical progress is the idea that there must be a development over time in which, in an intergenerational process of Juridification, of Verrechtlichung, the conditions for talent development become better and better. So we are now in a much better condition as in Königsberg at the end of the 18th century. But imagine a society which fosters and supports young people even more, and even us elderly or not so young people. And our development is then considerably improved. And now imagine a final stage of mankind in which the talents are really fulfilled. Yeah? And he says, yeah, it's regrettable, but it's a fact of human history that the former generations are for the sake of the future generations, since there is an accumulation of knowledge and an accumulation and improvement of legal orders. He calls that republicanization of the legal orders, namely that individual rights become more and more, and we are in a better political, social, and legal condition. And this idea is not so bad, and I think it's not really as weak as as other forms of philosophies of history. Yeah? Philosophy of history is not really a discipline which is done by so many colleagues in our times, since everybody has in his or her mind what Hegel and Marx made out of the history of philosophy, the philosophy of history. And so maybe the Kantian model is still to be considered as one possibility, since it is true, I think, that there is this accumulation of knowledge. So clearly, so every one of us buying a new smartphone or something doesn't want to have the model from 2019 or the car from 2015. The cars from 2015 has been excellent, but we want to have innovations and so on. So in a sense, we are still believers in this idea of progress, but confined not to society, but to the technical developments. And there is an accumulation of knowledge, clearly, which makes the society or evokes the reaction of the society towards the past. And we are now, for instance, very sad that the American society did not learn from the first Trump period, 2016 to 20, that Trump is such an incredibly bad politician that they shouldn't have voted for him again. But in principle, we believe that we could learn from history and learn from the mistakes of our grandfathers, grandmothers, for instance, in Europe, in the period of the Second World War, and we learned our lesson in Europe. We don't want to have a war anymore, but now is Putin attacking Ukraine? So in this sense, I think a philosophy of history can still be based on the idea of a moral progress, namely in the normative sense. So we must take history seriously. We must look at what fascism in Italy and National Socialism in Germany has been, or what Stalinism in the Soviet Union has been. We must learn from that, and this then is a chance to improve over time our societies and our international relationships.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if anyone would like to ask another question, because otherwise we are reaching our 2-hour period for the seminar. We are very grateful to Professor Horn for this beautiful lecture and for these very interesting comments. And we hope everyone would profit from hearing again. You just play the video again on YouTube and try to make sense of all these very important and very dense reflections offered by Professor Horn. Thank you very much. And I think you guys can you can open the camera, because we're going to have our final moment here. And once again, let me thank everyone, and I wish you all a good end of semester. You're supposed to send your papers by the 10th of December. As you understand, these are the deadlines of the university. So there won't be much that myself or Camila will be able to do about it. So please try to send us all the papers by the 10th of December. Just send us a PDF version of your paper via email. Thank you very much. Let me wish you all a good evening, good night of rest, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.